Welcome to the Jill on Money Show. It's Saturday, August 27th, and it's basically the Summer Author Series. We are re-airing interviews that we have conducted in the past with some of our favorite authors and interviewees. Today, we're talking to Brad Stulberg. He is the author of The Practice of Groundedness, a transformative path to success that feeds, not crushes, your soul. Now, we've talked so much about the things that do feed your soul, so I found this interview even better on the second listen because so much has happened since the time we actually talked to Brad. And I think this is a really evocative 2-day interview, and I think it's a great way to use the sort of late summer season to provoke you into thinking about how to improve your own lives. And sometimes you need a little money help to make that happen. But the first thing you need to do is to just think about this. So we start our interview by talking about Brad's previous book. You'll hear about that. Tell me first about Peak Performance and what that book was about.
I'm glad that you started here because I basically had to write my books in reverse to get to the Practice of Groundedness, which is the new book. And here's why. So Peak Performance is everything is clicking. You're on top of your game. And there is so much BS nonsense. I like to call it bro science out there.
Yeah, I hate
when
that.
When it comes to peak performance. Hacks, optimize your life, 10 supplements to become Superman or Superwoman in 10 days, on and on and on. And the goal with Peak Performance was to provide an evidence-based approach to what to do when you're on top of the mountain and ideally how to stay there. When everything is clicking, Peak Performance makes total sense. I completely stand by the work in that book. It's bulletproof. It's defensible. I wrote that book when I was younger. Then I had an event in my life that really shook the base of the mountain from underneath me. And I realized that while those principles are great for when everything is clicking, if the top of the mountain, and obviously we're talking in metaphor here, the top of your respective mountain, it's not as durable or sturdy or solid if it's not built on a really strong base. Hence the practice of groundedness, which is all about building that foundation, building that base. And it's often the base and the foundation that gets neglected when things are going well because it's a lot easier and perhaps more fun to focus on bright and shiny objects all the time.
Which is why it's funny you should say that. I'm just going to relate this to almost like being an investor. It drives me insane when people will not look to the downside when things are going well. And they will only freak out when the market has melted down. I'm like, isn't it easier just to look at what could happen when you're on top and fix it then wait till the bottom falls out? I mean, it just stands to reason. But it is hard if everything is clicking, unless you are a neurotic Jew like I am from the Northeast. It's hard to say what could possibly go wrong when you're up there. Is it necessary to do that kind of inventory if you're up on the mountain?
We're going to use all kinds of metaphors today, Jill. So we're going from mountain climbing back to investing. Okay. So a point that I make in the Practice of Groundedness, drawn from investing, is regression to the mean is real. You are going to have highs and you are going to have lows, but there is going to be some sort of average, and the trend line always drifts back towards average. Lows don't last forever, neither do highs. I think that the way that you want to approach building a high-performing life is to try to raise the mean. So over time, the mean gets a little bit higher. You still ride the highs and have a lot of fun and show up, get through the lows, get help when you need to. But if the mean that those ebbs and flows are returning to inches up over time, much like investing, that's how you build long-term gains. What I argue in the book is that's how you build long-term gain across any area of your life: happiness, health, fulfillment, relationships, and of course, money too.
It also reminds me of working out, which is something that I do. And I'm an old aging collegiate athlete. And I think that one of the things you learn when you work out as you get older is that, you can't necessarily do the things you could do in the same way. You don't bounce back the same way. But if you kind of stick with it and you sort of cultivate a life where this is important to you, that you'll find that things kind of like they stay pretty good, right? And I laugh at myself sometimes because I'm a Peloton rider. And so when I do these Power Zone classes, they talk about like, the reason I think I like them is that you only compare against yourself, not against anyone else. And I think the real tricky emotional trap that we can fall into is the mean is your mean. It's not the mean of your cohort. How do we help people not look to someone else to define that part of you that you want to raise up?
I'm really glad you asked. This is such a high stakes question and such an important skill to cultivate, particularly now. People have always tried to portray themselves through rosy tainted glasses out in the world. With the advent of the internet, and particularly social media, it is easier than ever to do so. Instagram quite literally has a function called filter. So there is both a literal way to filter how you look, and then, of course, a selective filtering of someone's life. And if we run into the trap of comparing ourselves with how other people portray themselves, we're trying to live up to a bar that is mostly an illusion, and we're going to burn ourselves out and make ourselves exhausted and miserable trying to do that. So I like to think about shifting the dashboard from external to internal. So an external dashboard is very much comparison to others. And it doesn't just have to be on the internet. It can also be job title. Am I a VP or am I in the C-suite? Did I win the gold medal or the bronze medal? Stuff's important, but I don't think it's healthy when that stuff's the driver. Whereas an internal dashboard is about knowing your core values. What are the things that you really value in your life? And then doing what you can to practice those values day in and day out, because you have full control over that. And what I argue in the Groundedness book is that paradoxically, by showing up and focusing on your internal dashboard, the external stuff tends to take care of itself. Back to the mountain. There are two ways to climb to the top of a mountain. One way is constantly obsessing about the peak, thinking about the selfies that you're going to take when you're up there, worried what will happen to your self-worth if you don't make it up to the peak, if you have to tell everyone, oh, I didn't make it. Another way to climb a mountain is to be where you are, to really focus on what you're going to do today, on each individual pitch, really on each individual step, and to enjoy all the life on the side of the mountain and to enjoy the view. Both climbers can get the same result. Both can make it to the top of the mountain. But the texture of the journey for the one that is present and patient is so much better and so much more fulfilling. And even if you're only performance mindset and you say, Brad, stop with this woo-woo stuff, I just want to be a great performer. Well, that second climber is going to be a better performer because they're going to have a greater reservoir of energy to draw from. Like, it is not sustainable. It is so utterly exhausting. I'm convinced even before COVID, it's why everyone's freaking tired all the time, is because we are constantly trying to measure up to like the Joneses, but now it's the digital Joneses with filters. And it's absolutely impossible. And it's everywhere. It's so, I wrote this book. It's something that I struggle with because it is so ubiquitous in our society right now.
This book is so personal. And right in the beginning, you really come out and say, I was blindsided by obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and what that meant to you, this, wonderkind kind of author and researcher, how this book came from that period of your life.
I had written Peak Performance and it had turned into a bestseller pretty quickly. And the manuscript of another book was already done. Really out of nowhere, as you said, I got blindsided by OCD, which is highly misunderstood. No malintentions. It's just the way that it's portrayed in the popular culture. So people hear OCD, they think of someone that is really organized, that's a clean freak. And that is not what like clinical actual OCD is. So first, the definition. OCD is having intrusive thoughts or feelings, becoming extremely anxious about those thoughts or feelings, and then trying to do something to make those thoughts and feelings go away. So it's a very human cycle except on OCD, it's complete overdrive. So I was bombarded by this. At the time, I thought it was very odd. It turns out to be a very common OCD theme, but I was bombarded by thoughts of meaninglessness of life. So really tough stuff. At first, I thought I was like depressed. I'm like, I need to be treated for major depression. What made it OCD is that those thoughts, again, they were accompanied by a lot of anxiety. And then my compulsion, the C part, was not visible. It was all internal. I did everything that I could to assure myself that I wasn't actually becoming depressed. So I'd spend hours and hours Googling the symptoms of depression. I would read countless philosophy books searching for the meaning of life, which, by the way, like it's an unanswerable question.
I was just going to say, would you like to share?
Yeah, seriously. So, but that's the thing, right? Like now, after a lot of therapy and treatment and really being on the other side of this, for the time being, at least, I can laugh at that. But in the moment, the stakes feel like they're everything. If I can't figure out this question, I can't get out of bed. That happened more or less overnight, Jill. Like everything was going really well. I had a panic attack. I never had a panic attack. And then I became just absolutely obsessed with why was this happening to me? What does it mean? Am I going to die? If I'm going to die, what's the point of living to begin with? And these thoughts completely consumed me. Hours and hours a day. I became scared to drive a car because I thought I'd drive it off the road. It was really, really bad. For a good 8 months, it just completely uprooted my whole life.
Wait a minute. So I got to go back. So you're perseverating around this. This is going like it's literally infecting your whole being. And it took you 8 months? Like, what was the tipping point where you said, did your mom say like, honey, you're not yourself, or a partner, or was it did you just surrender? How did you go from that state to getting help?
I'm glad you're asking a clarifying question. So I got help really quickly. It took 8 months to get better.
Okay, gotcha.
So I am very fortunate. Like there's never been stigma around mental illness in my life or in my family. And because I'd like to fancy myself as a pretty self-aware guy, I knew something was wrong. So after about 3 days of this, I came home and I told my wife, like, something is wrong with my brain. I'm trying not to freak out, but I need to see a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. And I was in a psychiatrist's office a week later. And I'm very fortunate that the psychiatrist I saw just happened to have expertise in OCD. Because what often happens, particularly with this theme of OCD, Jill, where like there's thoughts of meaninglessness and self-harm, is people are misdiagnosed with having really severe depression, suicidal ideation, and they're put into an inpatient treatment program for depression. Yeah. And I thought I needed that. I said, like, I don't trust myself. I'm not safe. And that's when he kind of laughed at me and said, oh, you're not depressed. You just have OCD. Because that is what characterizes OCD is. And I've learned all of this through the treatment. Traditionally, depression presents and like the thought of harming yourself relieves you. Whereas with OCD, you're terrified that you're even having the thought to begin with. I remember my shoulders just dropping because I thought like my brain was broken beyond repair. And when he said those words, you have OCD, first off, like so many people, I thought OCD was washing your hands all the time. I had no idea that it was this broader pattern of like intrusive thoughts. And then when he said that this is a very common theme and there's a treatment mechanism that's really hard, but also really effective, that's what got me on the way to healing.
And so on the road to healing, you wrote about this for a magazine. Was it that article that led you to think about the practice of groundedness?
Precisely. So that article, I have such visceral memories of the decision to write it. I was in Virginia on what was supposed to be like a little vacation with my brother. And I was in a pretty rough spot with OCD. I was probably 4 months into treatment, but there were still many rough patches at that point. And I opened up my computer in a coffee shop. It was down by the graduate school. I had an email from this guy that was like a 25-year-old that said, you know, you've got everything together. How do you do it? I want to be like you. And meanwhile, I am just completely falling apart. And the cognitive dissonance that I felt between how people looked at me and what was actually going on in that moment was worse than the OCD itself. And at that point, I said, I either need to write about this and eliminate that cognitive dissonance, or I just need to stop writing. And my therapist said, like, well, if you stop writing, that's just letting it encroach on one more area of your life. So why don't you write about it? And the worry with writing about it was never like, what are people going to think of me? I mean, my ego is way too big for that even back then. I don't care. If people want to think poorly, whatever, screw them. It was in the perverse mind of someone with OCD. I was scared that if I wrote about it, I would somehow be like exerting control over it, or saying like, I've got this under control, I can write about it. And then it was going to come back to get me even more. In the language of therapy, it's called exposure therapy. You do the things that give you anxiety. So my therapist said, great, this is like the perfect homework. Go write an article about it and let's see what happens after.
That was part one of our interview with Brad Stulberg. If you have questions that are piquing your interest as a result of these author interviews that we're re-airing, maybe it's getting you to consider your current work situation, how you want to live the next chapter of your life, what's important to you, we'd love to hear from you. Just go to the website, jillonmoney.com, click on the Contact Us button. Of course, let us know if you would like to come on the air. Mark does everything else. While you're on the website, sign up for the free weekly newsletter. It's really pretty awesome. Mark does it every Friday. Okie dokie. Let's remind you to lift someone up today. It's going to make that person feel better. It's going to make you feel better. Thank you so much for listening. Grit, growth, grace. We'll chat with you tomorrow.